The night air crackled with danger as Kang Min-ho sat at the family dinner table, his cold gaze fixed everywhere but on her. Maya's presence burned like wildfire beside him, her crimson dress, the tremor in her breath, the way her fingers gripped the champagne flute too tight, yet he ignored her completely, speaking only to his father about empire expansion. But when the first gunshot shattered the crystal chandelier overhead, when chaos erupted and bullets flew toward his heart, Maya didn't hesitate. She threw herself in front of him, her body becoming his shield, her blood staining the white tablecloth as love screamed louder than survival. In that singular, shattering moment, everything changed. He finally saw her. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance, where love has no borders. If you believe in love, please like, share, and subscribe for more Afro-Korean romance stories. Maya had learned long ago that waiting for someone was a kind of dying. She died a little every morning when Kang Min-ho left their penthouse without kissing her goodbye, died a little every evening when he returned with the scent of expensive whiskey and danger clinging to his tailored suit, his eyes 1,000 miles away. She was his wife in name, in legal documentation, in the sprawling diamond on her finger, but she was a ghost in his world. The marriage had been arranged by their family 6 months ago. She was 28, an architect with soft eyes and softer dreams, the daughter of a wealthy Afro-Korean businessman who'd built his fortune in imports. Min-ho was 32, a legend in Seoul's underworld, a man whose smile could charm or destroy depending on his mood, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Their wedding had been lavish, held at the Shilla Hotel with 300 guests watching as he kissed her once, a cold, performative gesture, and then spent the entire reception talking to his father about territorial disputes. She'd tried to reach him in those first weeks. She'd learned his coffee order Americano, 3 sugars, waited up late hopping for conversation, wore the lingerie her best friend insisted would work. Min-ho had been polite, distant. Like someone acknowledging a beautiful painting they'd inherited but had no real interest in keeping. By month 4 of their marriage, Maya had stopped trying. The penthouse was her prison and her kingdom in equal measure. 40 floors above Seoul, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than most people's houses, she filled her days with architectural projects and empty nights with wine. She attended the required galas, smiled the required smile, wore the required dress, and played the required role of Kang Min-ho's beautiful, obedient wife. No one knew that sometimes she cried in the shower, or that she'd already consulted a divorce lawyer twice, or that she was slowly, devastatingly falling in love with a man who treated her like an obligation. This evening, the family dinner that would change everything, started like every other obligation. Maya was in her dressing room, a space larger than most apartments, staring at 3 dresses laid across the bed. Black was safe, red was dangerous, gold was a compromise. She chose the red, a silk number that hugged her curves and fell to mid-thigh because she was exhausted by being invisible. If she was going to be ignored, she might as well be strikingly ignored. When Min-ho emerged from his study, all sharp angles and colder eyes, dressed in a 3-piece suit that probably cost more than a car, he didn't even glance at her. "The dinner starts at 8, don't be late," he said, checking his Rolex, then disappearing to take a call in the living room. Maya smoothed her dress in the mirror and whispered to her reflection, "Happy wife." Kang family estate was a fortress disguised as elegance. Located in the Gangnam district, surrounded by walls and security that rivaled military bases, it was where the empire's real business happened. The dining room alone could seat 50, but tonight only the core family had been summoned. Min-ho's father, Kang De-young, a man in his 60s with the bearing of an ancient king. His mother, too kind to ask questions about how her son's money was made. Min-ho's younger brother, Yi-sung, who worked in the family's legitimate shipping business and never attended these darker dinners. And Min-ho's cousin, Seok-jun, who ran operations in Busan and regarded everyone with the suspicion of a criminal, which he was. Maya had learned to identify the temperature of these dinners by Min-ho's demeanor when they arrived. Tonight, he was ice. He handed her out of the car with the courtesy of a stranger assisting an elderly woman, one hand at her elbow, his gaze scanning the estate's perimeter. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his other hand stayed near his jacket pocket where his security team assured her he always kept protection. Something was wrong. Something was coming. "Stay close tonight," he said quietly as they climbed the stone steps. It was the first real instruction he'd given her all week. The dining room was already tense when they entered. The table gleamed with white linens and Swarovski crystal. Candles flickered. A staff member moved silently, pouring wine. Kang De-young sat at the head of the table like a patriarch from another era, his face carved from granite. When he saw Min-ho, his expression shifted into something that might have been approval, and Min-ho bowed slightly, still showing respect, still playing son despite being 32 and running half the city's underworld. "Min-ho," his father said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Sit, we have much to discuss." Min-ho pulled out the chair next to De-young, positioned where he could see every entrance and exit. Maya was meant to sit 2 chairs down beside her mother-in-law where wives belonged. Min-ho didn't help her with her chair, didn't acknowledge her existence. When the soup course arrived, he was already deep in conversation with his father about something coded as market competition and market shares, which Maya understood meant territories and which criminal organizations were encroaching on Kang family business. She tried not to mind. She'd gotten good at not minding. She sipped her soup and listened to her mother-in-law discuss an upcoming charity gala, and somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where hope had once lived, she felt something quiet and final close shut. Choi Syndicate has been moving into Hongdae, Seok-jun said from across the table, and Min-ho's eyes hardened into something lethal. They're recruiting, offering better cuts. We've already lost 12 men this month. Then eliminate the incentive, Kang Deyoung said simply, as though he were discussing trimming a garden. Remove the leadership. Choi Min-suk thinks he can build an empire on our foundation. Remind him why that's impossible. Min-ho nodded once. That small economical gesture that Maya had learned meant death for someone. She felt her appetite disappear. Around the table the discussion continued: numbers, names, operations, a gun shipment, a politician who needed convincing. A rival's mistress who could be leverage. She was used to this, the casual discussion of violence, but something about tonight felt different. Something felt like the room was holding its breath. That's when Min-ho finally looked at her. For barely a second his eyes found hers across the table. Not warm, not cold exactly, empty, like she was a chair, expensive and ornamental and utterly unimportant. Then he looked away, back to his father, back to the conversation that mattered. Maya set down her spoon with careful precision. Later that night in the car ride home, Min-ho's phone rang constantly. He took 3 calls, his voice low and clipped. When they arrived at the penthouse he told her he had business to attend to and disappeared into his study. She heard the sound of a safe opening, metal on metal, the specific click of a weapon being loaded. She changed into pajamas and got into the bed that felt too large for one person, and she made a decision. Not tonight, not tomorrow. But soon she would end this. She would sign the papers, accept whatever settlement she could get, and reclaim her life. She was 28 years old. She had time to find someone who would look at her, actually look at her with recognition. With want she fell asleep to the sound of Min-ho in the shower, the spray of water, the sounds of a man preparing for something dangerous. The next morning everything changed. Min-ho emerged from his study at 5 a.m., freshly showered, wearing dark tactical clothing. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw tight. He found Maya in the kitchen. She'd woken early, unable to sleep, and made coffee out of habit, and for the first time since that dinner he actually spoke to her like she was human. "Pack a bag," he said, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been concern. "You're going to your family's house in Busan." Maya turned from the espresso machine, confusion blooming across her face. "What? Why?" "Security situation." He didn't elaborate. He just moved through the kitchen like a predator, grabbing a protein bar, his movements economical and precise. "I'm having 2 of my men escort you. You'll stay there for a week, possibly longer. You don't leave the house, you don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize, and you don't tell anyone where you are." "Oh, this is not a discussion." His eyes finally locked on hers, and what she saw there shocked her. Fear, protectiveness, something raw beneath the ice. "The Choi situation is escalating. There's a possibility they'll target family members. I'm moving my mother and brother too. You will be safe, but only if you comply." The first time since their wedding Maya heard genuine concern in his voice, but the moment passed quickly. He was already moving toward the door, already disconnecting. "Long will you be gone?" she asked. He paused, didn't turn around. "As long as it takes." Been in Busan for 4 days. When she realized she was checking her phone every 5 minutes, hopping for a message from him. Nothing came. No "I miss you," no updates, no anything. She spent her time with her parents, who asked carefully about her marriage, her mother's eyes full of knowing pity. She walked on the beach. She drank too much wine. She cried once behind a bathroom door, surprised at her own capacity for heartbreak over a man who'd never really been hers. On the 5th day her father called her to his study, a warm book-lined room that smelled like leather and good decisions. "Your mother is worried about you," he said, not looking up from his desk. "I'm fine," Maya lied. Clearly not fine. He set down his pen and finally looked at his daughter. "Does this have to do with Min-ho?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say, "He ignores me, he married me out of business necessity, he treats me like a beautiful piece of furniture he never wanted." Instead she said, "He's just busy with family business." Her father leaned back in his chair. "The business? Yes, I've heard. The Choi Syndicate is making moves. There's word of an assassination attempt being planned." He paused, watching her. "Min-ho's people caught wind of it yesterday. I believe it's being handled." "Handled?" Maya asked, though she already knew what that meant. "That's the life he chose, Maya. That's the life you chose when you married him." Her father's voice was gentle but firm. "I knew going into this arrangement that Kang Min-ho was no ordinary businessman. I made peace with it because I trust he'll protect you. Do you trust him?" She thought of Min-ho's eyes that morning, the fear, the protectiveness. She thought of him moving her to safety immediately, taking the threat seriously. She thought of everything she didn't actually know about how he felt because he'd never told her, never shown her, never made any real effort to bridge the distance he'd maintained since their wedding night. "I don't know," she said, and meant it. She returned to Seoul on the 8th day because Min-ho sent for her. No phone call, no message, just a car that pulled up to her parents' house with one of his security officers who said simply, "The boss requests your presence." Penthouse was quiet when she arrived, unusually quiet. No phones ringing, no sound of Min-ho's voice on calls, no evidence of the controlled chaos that usually occupied his time. She found him in the living room pouring a drink, the city lights spread beneath them like fallen stars. He looked exhausted. There was a bandage on his left arm, visible where his shirt sleeve had been rolled up. A bruise was darkening across his jaw. His eyes, when they met hers, held something she'd never seen before: uncertainty. The threat has been neutralized, he said by way of greeting. You can resume your normal schedule. You okay? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment, then he turned back to his drink. Yes, but he wasn't okay. She could see it in the way he held himself, like he was trying to contain something fractured inside him. She wanted to ask what happened, wanted to know if he'd been hurt, wanted to press herself against his chest and demand that he let her in. Instead, she said, I'm going to rest. I've had a long drive. She heard him exhale slowly, heard the clink of glass against glass as he poured another drink. That night she laid in their bed and listened to him in the living room, moving around like a ghost, like he couldn't settle anywhere. Around 3 a.m. she heard the shower turn on. She heard silence. She heard nothing until dawn broke and he left without saying goodbye. 3 weeks passed. Min-ho fell back into his patterns of cold distance, but something had shifted beneath the surface. She'd catch him watching her sometimes. When he thought she wasn't paying attention, his gaze would track her across a room with an intensity that made her feel like she was burning. She'd catch him leaving things for her. A book she'd mentioned wanting to read left on her pillow. Her favorite flowers, peonies, appearing on the dining room table for no occasion. A new tablet already loaded with architectural software she'd been considering purchasing. He never mentioned leaving these things. She never thanked him, afraid of breaking whatever spell was forming. But she noticed. She noticed everything about him now with painful clarity. The way he took his coffee, the scar along his right ribcage that she'd seen once, the small smile he got when he was amused, which was rare. A month after she returned from Busan, there was a gala. One of Seoul's most exclusive charity events benefiting children's hospitals. Min-ho had made a donation, probably because his legitimate business interests benefited from the goodwill, or because his mother had asked. They arrived together, a stunning couple in formal wear, him in a tuxedo that cost more than most people's annual salary, her in a gold gown that draped like liquid. Within the first hour, he'd left her side to speak with business associates. Within the second hour, she found herself in conversation with Park Jae-ho, a physician at Seoul's most prestigious hospital, a man about her age who was genuinely interested in her architectural work and who smiled at her like she mattered. She shouldn't have been flirting with him. She was a married woman. But Min-ho was across the room, chatting with a stunning woman in silver, a woman with perfect posture and perfect makeup and no wedding ring, and the jealousy that erupted in her was so fierce and sudden that she gasped. Are you okay? Jae-ho asked, concerned. Yes, fine, excuse me for a moment, she said, and she turned away, needing air, needing space, needing to not see Min-ho's eyes smile at that woman while he held her hand for a fraction too long. She found herself on the balcony, the night air of Seoul swallowing her whole. She'd been foolish, so foolish. She let herself start to care, started to imagine that the small gestures meant something, started to hope that maybe eventually Min-ho could be the kind of husband who actually wanted her. Behind her, she heard the balcony door open. We're leaving, Min-ho said. His voice was quiet, but it held an edge sharp enough to draw blood. She turned. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark as a storm. He looked at her with an intensity that made her mouth go dry. We just arrived, she said carefully. I don't care. He moved toward her and she instinctively stepped backward until her lower back hit the railing. We're leaving now. Min-ho, what? Did he touch you? The question landed like a slap. What? The doctor, did he touch you? His hand came up to her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. His touch was gentle, but his eyes were absolutely lethal. Because I noticed that his hand was on the small of your back. I noticed that you were smiling at him. I noticed that you were looking at him the way you've never looked at me. I wasn't, she started, but he stepped closer and suddenly they were barely breathing room apart and everything she'd felt for the past month crystallized into a single overwhelming need. Lie to me, Maya. His voice dropped. His hand moved to her jaw, tilting her face up to his. Tell me that you don't know what you do to me. Tell me that you haven't noticed me watching you. Tell me that you don't feel what's happening between us. She couldn't lie, the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, trembling, drowning in the intensity of his focus. That man, Park Jae-ho, he will never see you again, Min-ho continued, and there was something dangerous and possessive in every syllable. No man will. You are mine, Maya. In every way that matters, you are already mine. You never, she tried to speak, but his thumb moved across her lower lip, silencing her. I know. The pain in his eyes was raw, suddenly visible. I've been a fool. I was trying to give you space, trying to let you adjust, trying to be someone you could respect, but I can't anymore. I can't watch other men look at you. I can't pretend that our marriage is just business. What are you saying? She whispered. I'm saying, he breathed, and then he was kissing her finally, and it was everything she'd imagined in those long, lonely nights. It was possessive and gentle and desperate and tender all at once. His hands came up to cup her face and he kissed her like he was claiming her, like he was confessing everything he couldn't say with words. When he pulled away, they were both breathing hard. Come home with me, he said against her lips. Right now, let me show you what I should have shown you months ago. They left the gala without goodbyes. In the car, Min-ho's hand never left her thigh, his touch burning through the silk of her dress. He made 3 phone calls, his voice curt and commanding, ensuring that his security team had marked Park Jae-ho as a non-contact, as someone to monitor, as a threat to be neutralized if necessary. She should have been horrified by that. Instead, she was aroused. The penthouse was dark except for the city lights. Min-ho locked the door behind them, a deliberate gesture, and turned to her. He reached for her carefully like she was something precious and fragile. "Sorry," he said. "For every day I made you feel like you didn't matter. For every moment I looked away when I should have been looking directly at you. For being too afraid to admit that I fell in love with you the moment you walked down that aisle, that I've been dying slowly trying to keep my distance." She asked, her heart breaking and rebuilding in the same moment. "Why did you stay away?" "Because you deserved a choice. You didn't choose this marriage. I was afraid that if I showed you how much I wanted you, I'd be taking away your agency. I was afraid that you'd feel trapped." He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "But I can't be noble anymore, Maya. I can't pretend I don't feel you like a heartbeat. I can't pretend that watching you with that man tonight didn't nearly destroy me." She kissed him then, desperately, totally, giving him everything she'd been holding back. He responded immediately, his hands moving to her waist, to the zipper of her dress, and as the gold silk fell to the floor, as she felt the air conditioning against bare skin, as he lifted her and carried her to the bedroom, she understood what it meant to be truly seen. They came together in the darkness, 2 people who had been orbiting each other for months finally colliding. She felt the weight of him, the strength in his arms, the tenderness in his touch despite his obvious hunger. She heard him whisper her name like a prayer, felt him take his time even as his body demanded urgency. When he was inside her, when they were truly united, she finally understood why people wrote poems and songs and built empires. Love was the only force worth the destruction. Later, as they lay in the darkness, his arms wrapped around her, his lips against her hair, she allowed herself to believe that this might be real, that this might last, that she might finally have what she'd been dying for. "Love you," he murmured against her ear. "I've loved you since I watched you walk toward me at the altar, and I'm sorry it took me this long to be brave enough to show you." She turned in his arms to face him. Even in the darkness, she could see his eyes, could see the absolute certainty there. She kissed him softly and said, "I love you too. I hated you for a while, but I loved you the whole time." He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that she'd rarely heard from him, and kissed her again, tenderly, reverently, like she was the most precious thing he possessed. For the first time since their wedding, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The next week was a dream. Min-ho transformed. He came home early. He held her hand in the car. He looked at her constantly, like he still couldn't believe she was real. He left her love notes in her coffee cup, her shoes, her architectural sketches. He took her to dinner, just the 2 of them, and spoke about his dreams and fears and the weight of the empire he carried. He was still dangerous, she could see that in the sharp lines of his face, the calculated way he moved, but with her he chose gentleness. Then on the 8th night, everything shattered. She woke to find him getting dressed in dark clothing, checking weapons with a precision that suggested he wasn't coming back if he didn't have to. "What's happening?" she asked, her stomach already clenching with dread. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said, but his jaw was tight, his eyes distant. "I have business to handle." "Business that requires weapons?" He didn't answer. He just kissed her forehead and said, "Lock the doors, don't let anyone in, I'll call when I can." "Ho, I love you," he said, and something in his voice made her heart stop. "If anything happens, nothing will happen," she interrupted, unable to bear whatever warning he was about to give her. You're coming back to me." He looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to prepare her for the possibility that he might not. Instead, he kissed her once more and left. She didn't sleep that night. She drank wine and paste and tried to tell herself that he was a powerful man, that he knew how to survive. But something felt different about this. Something felt final. The next morning there was no call. The day passed in silence. Her phone remained dark. By evening she was searching news feeds for reports of violence in Seoul, terrified of what she'd find. By 9 p.m. she was dressed and calling for a car because she couldn't stand the waiting anymore. She went to the address she knew, not the penthouse but the warehouse in Gangnam, the place where Min-ho conducted his darkest business. She shouldn't have known about it, but she'd seen it on his phone once, mentioned in a coded text. Her security team tried to stop her, but she simply walked past them. She was the boss's wife. She had authority that she'd never exercised before. The warehouse was dark except for a single light in the upper floor. She climbed the metal stairs, her heart thundering in her chest, and what she found would change everything forever. Min-ho was there, shirtless, his entire upper body covered in blood, some of it his own, some of it not. Standing across from him was a man she recognized, Choi Min-suk, the rival syndicate boss, battered and defeated but still breathing. Min-ho's gun was pointed at his chest. "Min-ho," she breathed. His eyes snapped to hers, and she watched the man she loved recede, replaced by something pure and predatory. "Maya, you shouldn't be here. Don't do this," she said, moving toward him. "Please don't cross this line." "There is no line I won't cross," he said, his voice empty. "This man sent people to kill me. He threatened to take you. I will destroy him and every person he's ever loved." "I know," she said, and she did. She understood his violence now, understood that it was an extension of his love. "But you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself." She moved closer, step by step, until she could reach out and place her hand on his gun arm. "Put it down," she whispered. "Come home with me. Let the law handle this, or let your father, but don't destroy yourself for me." He looked at her and she saw the war happening behind his eyes, the desire for vengeance, the need to ensure her absolute safety, battling against his love for her. He could hurt you, he said desperately. If I don't end this now, he could hurt you. I know, she said, but I'm here, I'm choosing you. Regardless of what he can or cannot do, I'm choosing to stand with you. That's your power, Min-ho, that's what truly makes you invulnerable. She felt the moment the gun lowered. Felt the moment his entire body went rigid then released, like years of tension finally breaking free. I could have lost you, he whispered, and she realized he was shaking. You haven't, she said firmly. I'm right here, I'm not going anywhere. He lowered the gun, handed it to his second-in-command who appeared from the shadows, and then he was pulling her into his arms, his entire body convulsing with what might have been sobs or rage or the profound release of fear. Choi Min-suk was arrested later that night. Min-ho had called his contact in the prosecutor's office and let justice handle the rest. As they rode home in the car, Maya held Min-ho's hand and realized that she had crossed a line she could never return from. She had seen the darkest part of him. And she loved him anyway. I need to tell you something, she said softly. He looked at her, concern crossing his face. What? When you were gone last night, I realized that I can't live without you anymore. I don't want to live without you. And I'm not asking you to change or to become someone different. I'm asking you to let me be part of your life, all of it, the beautiful and the terrible. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head and said, that's all I've ever wanted. For you to see me completely and choose me anyway. Arrived at the penthouse as dawn was breaking. He showered while she made coffee, and when he emerged he was still wet-haired and raw, but he looked lighter somehow, like something that had been poisoning him had finally been extracted. Marry me again, he said suddenly. She nearly dropped her coffee cup. What? Not the ceremony we had, not the business arrangement. Marry me for real this time. Marry me knowing exactly who I am, what I'm capable of, what my life entails. Marry me because you want to, not because our families arranged it. He took her hands, kneeling in front of her with the unself-conscious grace of a king. Marry me, Maya, give me that. She didn't hesitate, she simply said yes. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of dangerous and domestic. Min-ho's father, recognizing that his son had been fundamentally changed by love, began transitioning more of his business to other hands. Yi-sung, his younger brother, stepped in to oversee more of the legitimate operations. The family was evolving, but the danger, Min-ho assured her, never truly disappeared. There were always rivals, always threats. He was always armed, always guarded, always scanning rooms for exits and potential threats. And yet he came home to her every night. He held her like she was his anchor to humanity. He whispered promises into her skin when he thought she was asleep. She was so lost in the happiness of finally being chosen that she didn't notice the first subtle signs. The nausea in the mornings, the unexpected exhaustion, the way certain foods made her stomach turn. She took the test on a Tuesday, alone in the penthouse bathroom, and stared at the pink line like it was a miracle. When Min-ho came home that evening, she was waiting for him in the living room, the test hidden but not hidden, tucked into her pocket like a secret that was burning to get out. Have something to tell you, she said, and she was smiling so hard her face hurt. He immediately looked alarmed. Are you okay? Is something wrong? No, nothing's wrong, she said, laughing, and she pulled out the test and showed him, his face transformed. The hard, dangerous man, the mafia boss who had broken people without hesitation, went absolutely still. Then he took the test from her trembling hands and looked at it like it contained the secrets of the universe. We're having a baby, he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Having a baby, she confirmed, and when he pulled her into his arms, when he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, she felt the final click of something settling into place. This was what love was. Not the beginning, not the courtship, but this, choosing each other over and over again, building something together despite all the reasons not to, creating life from passion and commitment and the pure, stubborn will to survive. The wedding, their real wedding, took place 3 months later at the Kang family estate, but this time it was intimate. Only family and closest friends. And this time, when Min-ho looked at Maya as she walked toward him in a simple white dress, everyone in attendance felt the intensity of his gaze, understood that this was a man claiming his greatest treasure. He wept during the vows. She laughed, surprised and delighted. When he kissed her, the room erupted in applause and joy. That night in their penthouse, as her belly had just begun to swell with their child, he traced the curve with gentle hands and said, I will die before I let anything hurt you or our baby. That's not a promise, that's a vow to the universe. I know, she said, running her fingers through his hair. That's why I trust you. He kissed her belly, and their daughter, they would learn it was a girl at 6 months, seemed to respond, a flutter of movement that made them both gasp. She knows her father loves her, Maya whispered. Min-ho looked up at his wife, at the woman who had saved his life not with a bullet but with her presence, her love, her absolute refusal to let him be consumed by his own darkness. Love you, he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. I know, she said. I've known for a very long time. I was just waiting for you to catch up. He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed him from dangerous to beautiful, and as the city lights of Seoul spread beneath them like fallen stars, they held each other, two people who had been brought to the brink of destruction and instead had chosen creation. When his security team found them early the next morning, they reported to his second-in-command that the boss and his wife were still asleep, her hand on his chest, his arm protectively around her, looking more at peace than anyone had ever seen them. The empire would continue. The danger would never fully disappear. But in that penthouse above Seoul, a new kind of power was growing, the power of love, of family, of a man who had learned that his greatest strength wasn't in his cruelty, but in his capacity to protect what mattered most. And when their daughter was born 6 months later, a beautiful baby girl with her mother's eyes and her father's determined chin, Kang Min-ho held her in his strong, scarred hands and wept, understanding finally that this was what all his violence had been protecting. Not an empire of money and fear, but this moment, this life. They named her Dahlia, a flower known for its strength and beauty, its ability to thrive even in harsh conditions. And every day for the rest of his life, Min-ho would look at his wife, the woman who had thrown herself in front of a bullet for him, and remember that love was the only empire worth building. The maternity ward at Seoul Medical Center was transformed into a fortress. Min-ho had ensured it. Security at every entrance, his most trusted men positioned discreetly throughout the floor, medical staff vetted and cleared personally. Maya lay in the hospital bed, her hand gripping his like it was a life raft in a turbulent sea, and he watched her with an intensity that made the nurses nervous. Doing beautifully, the doctor assured her, checking her progression. The baby is in perfect position, we're almost there. Min-ho's face was a study in controlled panic. This man who had orchestrated violent takedowns without flinching, who had negotiated with rival syndicates over the corpses of his enemies, looked like he might faint. He'd refused all medication to steady his nerves, insisted on being present for every moment, and his hand trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from Maya's forehead. "I can't do this," Maya gasped between contractions, her body betraying her, pain consuming everything. "Yes, you can," Min-ho said fiercely, leaning close to her ear. "You took a bullet for me, remember? You walked into darkness without hesitation. This is nothing compared to your strength. Push through this and we'll have our daughter. Push through and our family is complete." She looked at him, this dangerous man who had become her entire world, and found the strength she needed. With the next contraction she pushed, and the room filled with the sound of a baby's first cry. A sound so pure, so perfect that Min-ho actually staggered backward like he'd been physically struck. Dahlia came into the world screaming, her tiny fists clenched, and when the nurse placed her on Maya's chest, both parents simply stared at her like she was an impossibility, a miracle they had somehow earned despite their flaws and violence. "Hello, my beautiful girl," Maya whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, my daughter." Min-ho couldn't speak. He knelt beside the bed and carefully, reverently placed his large hand on Dahlia's small back, feeling her breathe, her heart beating against his palm. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in his chest. The empire he'd built, the power he'd accumulated, the fear he'd cultivated, none of it meant anything compared to this fragile, perfect life he and Maya had created. "I'm going to protect you forever," he whispered to his daughter. "Both of you. For as long as I live, nothing will harm you." Promise wasn't poetic. It was a vow made to himself, to his wife, to the universe, and he would keep it no matter the cost. Bringing Dahlia home to the penthouse was surreal. The space that had always felt like a sleek, impersonal fortress suddenly became a home. There was a nursery now. Decorated in soft creams and pale greens, filled with the most expensive crib money could buy, though what Dahlia wanted was simply to be held. Min-ho couldn't stop holding her. During those early weeks, he'd often just stand by her crib at 3 in the morning, watching her sleep, his hand resting gently on her tiny back. Maya watched her husband transform into a father with a wonder that rivaled her love for him. This was the man who had once ordered a rival's warehouse burned. This was the man whose reputation made hardened criminals nervous. And yet she'd seen him spend 40 minutes trying to get Dahlia to latch correctly, frustration and determination warring across his face. She'd seen him rock her for hours, singing softly in Korean, the same songs his mother had probably sung to him. One night, about 3 weeks after Dahlia's birth, Maya woke to find the bed empty. She found Min-ho in the nursery, shirtless, holding their daughter against his chest while she slept. In the moonlight streaming through the window, he looked younger, somehow less haunted. She could see the man he might have been if he'd been born into a different family, chosen a different path. "She has your eyes," he said softly, not looking up. "That intensity, like she's seeing right through people to their souls." "Has your protectiveness," Maya replied, moving to stand beside them. "She grabs my finger like she's afraid I might disappear." "Will you?" he asked, and the question carried the weight of all his fears. "Will you leave, now that she's here, now that you've given me everything? Will you realize that you could do better than this life?" Maya placed her hand on his cheek, forcing him to look at her. "No," she said simply, "I will never leave. I knew what I was getting into, Min-ho. I knew who you were, and I chose you anyway. I choose you every day, and I will choose you every day for the rest of my life." He kissed her then, a kiss that was tender and desperate and full of relief. The trouble started when Dahlia was 2 months old. It came in the form of a phone call to Min-ho's secure line, a message coded in the language of the underworld. One of his associates, a man named Park Teo who ran operations in Incheon, had been arrested. Worse, he was talking, giving up names, operations, safe houses. Everything. Min-ho's face turned to stone when he received the call. He was in his study when Maya found him, already reaching for his jacket, already calling his security team. "What's happening?" she asked, though she could read the answer in his expression. "Business," he said, which meant danger. Min-ho, I have to go, there's an emergency, I don't know how long I'll be. He was already moving, already closing himself off, already becoming the man he was when he left her. But then he paused and he came back to her, pulling her close. If anything happens, if you feel unsafe for even a moment, you call my father. You take Dahlia and you go to the penthouse safe room. Understand? Nothing's going to happen, she said, but she was lying and he knew it. Promise me, he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders. Promise me you'll protect her if I can't. I promise, she whispered. He left before dawn and Maya didn't hear from him for 18 hours. The silence was suffocating. She held Dahlia and tried not to imagine the worst, tried not to picture Min-ho dead in some warehouse, tried not to let her mind spiral into the darkness that constantly lurked at the edges of her new happiness. When he finally called, his voice was rough, exhausted, and he said only, "It's handled, I'm coming home." But something had changed. Over the next few weeks, Maya noticed the increased security, more men at the penthouse, checks of the building's perimeter. Min-ho looking over his shoulder constantly. He was preparing for something, bracing for impact. The answer came from an unexpected source, her father. He called her on a Tuesday morning, asked her to meet him for coffee, and when she arrived at the cafe in Gangnam, she found him looking every one of his years and then some. "There's talk," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "In circles both legitimate and otherwise. Talk that someone wants to move against Min-ho. Not through direct confrontation, he's too strong for that, but through his family, through you and the baby." Maya's stomach dropped. "Who? Doesn't matter who. What matters is that Min-ho know. He's been making moves to protect you, but there's something else you should know." Her father leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's a woman, her name is Yeon-hee. She's a prosecutor and she's building a case against Min-ho and his father. She has evidence, years of it. If she succeeds, Min-ho could be imprisoned." "How do you know this?" Maya asked, her mind already spinning. "Because she came to me," her father said grimly. "She asked if I could confirm certain details about Min-ho's operations. She was hoping I might cooperate in exchange for protection for you and Dahlia. She believes that Min-ho won't survive long in prison, that rival syndicates will make a move. She thinks she's protecting you by trying to take him down." "That's insane," Maya said. "Min-ho is the only one who can protect me." "I know," her father said. "That's why I'm telling you, you need to be prepared for the possibility that the man you love might face prosecution. You need to decide right now whether you'll stand by him or step away." She didn't even hesitate. "I'll stand by him, of course I will," her father smiled sadly. "I thought you'd say that, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to tell Min-ho about this prosecutor. You're going to tell him everything I've told you. And you're going to let him decide how to respond. But Maya, listen to me carefully. If he chooses to leave the life, if he chooses to step away from the empire to protect you and Dahlia, you need to support that decision, even if it costs you everything." That night, she told him. They were in the penthouse, Dahlia asleep in her bassinet beside their bed, and Maya laid out everything her father had told her. She watched Min-ho's face cycle through disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally something that looked like resignation. "Prosecutor Yeon-hee," he said, more to himself than to her. "She's sharp, determined, she could actually do it." "It matter?" Maya asked. "Can't you just handle this like you handle everything else?" He looked at her and there was a sadness in his eyes that broke her heart. "There was a time when I would have. When I would have simply made her disappear, made her evidence disappear, made anyone who threatened me disappear." He moved to the window, looking out at the city that had been his kingdom. "But that man is gone now. That man died the moment you threw yourself in front of a bullet for me." "Don't understand," she said. "I know." He turned back to her and his expression was resolved. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, about what kind of father I want to be for Dahlia. What kind of world I want to raise her in. And the answer is not this one, not one built on fear and violence and blood." Maya's breath caught. "Are you saying that I'm going to step down from the family business? I'm going to turn over operations to my father and Seokjun. I'm going to work with our lawyers to ensure that I'm protected legally, that evidence against me is problematic, and I'm going to try to become the kind of man who doesn't have to sleep with a gun under his pillow." "That will take time," Maya said. "The prosecutor won't stop just because you announce a retirement." "I know," he came back to her, took her hands. "Which is why I need you to trust me. I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect you and Dahlia, even if it means facing prosecution, even if it means prison, but I refuse to keep living the life that makes my daughter's mother a target." "Min-ho, no." "Yes," he said firmly. "This is my choice. This is me choosing a different path. And I need you to believe that this is the right decision." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that he was overcomplicating things, that his power was his protection, but she also saw the absolute certainty in his eyes and she understood that this wasn't a decision he'd made lightly. This was a man reclaiming his humanity piece by piece. "Okay," she said finally. "I believe you, I trust you." He kissed her forehead and said, "That's all the strength I need." The next morning, Min-ho called a meeting with his father. Maya wasn't present, but she could hear his voice from the study, calm, resolved, brooking no argument. By afternoon it was done. An announcement was made within the family's inner circle. Kang Min-ho was stepping back from active operations. Effective immediately, his father was resuming control, with Seokjun handling day-to-day management. The underworld reacted with shock and confusion. A man didn't simply step away from power. Men like Min-ho were supposed to hold on until death claimed them. But Min-ho was serious. He stopped carrying weapons. He stopped attending meetings. He stopped being the enforcer and became something else. A man trying to build a normal life. It was harder than he expected. 3 weeks into his transition, Prosecutor Yeon-hee made her move. She arrested Min-ho's father on charges of organized crime, money laundering, and racketeering. The evidence was substantial and she clearly intended to build a larger case around the entire Kang family operation. Min-ho was philosophical about it. "My father's lawyers are excellent, he'll survive this," he told Maya, though she could see the strain around his eyes. "And this actually helps us. It shows that I'm separated from operations. My departure was genuine." But the prosecutor wasn't finished. She came for Min-ho 2 days later, armed with a warrant and evidence of his role in specific crimes spanning the past 5 years. He was arrested early in the morning, taken from their penthouse in front of security cameras, processed, and placed in a cell to await his hearing. Maya watched it happen on the news, holding Dahlia, and felt her entire world tilt sideways. The hearing was scheduled for 3 days later. Min-ho's legal team, the best money could buy, prepared for war. They filed motions, challenged evidence, prepared arguments about admissibility and prosecution bias. But Maya knew that none of it might matter. Min-ho had done these things. He'd ordered operations, approved violence, built wealth through crime. The question was whether he could convince a judge that he deserved leniency. She visited him in jail the day before the hearing. He sat across from her in the visitation room, wearing a gray prison uniform that somehow made his intensity even more pronounced. She noticed he'd been in a fight. There was a bruise on his jaw, fresh and dark. "Don't," he said before she could ask. "It's nothing. One of the other inmates recognized me. We had a conversation." "You win?" she asked, unable to help herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Of course. She reached across the table and took his hand, not caring about the rules or the guards watching. "I love you," she said, "no matter what happens tomorrow." "I know," he squeezed her hand. "And I love you. I love Dahlia. I love the life we're building, and I'm going to fight like hell to get back to it." The hearing was a spectacle. Media swarmed the courthouse. Min-ho's attorneys presented evidence of his withdrawal from operations, character witnesses including his mother and brother, who testified to his desire to change. Prosecutor Yeon-hee countered with documentation of his crimes, video evidence, testimony from his former associates who'd turned state's evidence. Min-ho took the stand in his own defense, a risky move but one his lawyers had calculated carefully. He spoke about his transformation, about becoming a father, about the moment when he realized that power meant nothing without someone to share it with. He spoke about Maya with such raw devotion that even the prosecutor seemed taken aback. "I was a criminal," he admitted, his voice steady. "I ordered violence. I built wealth through illegal means. I don't deny any of that. But I'm asking this court to consider that a man can change. That love can fundamentally transform who we are. That becoming a father showed me that my path was leading only to destruction, either of myself or of the people I loved." Judge listened, her expression unreadable. When the verdict came down, guilty on 3 counts but with a recommendation of leniency due to cooperating with prosecutors and withdrawing from criminal operations, the courtroom erupted. Min-ho's sentence was 5 years with possibility of parole after 3. It was better than expected, but it was still 5 years away from his family. He looked at Maya in the gallery and she saw him mouth, "I love you." She mouthed it back, tears streaming down her face, but Min-ho didn't serve those 5 years. He served exactly 6 months before circumstances changed everything. It began with an unexpected alliance. Prosecutor Yeon-hee came to visit him in prison, a move that shocked everyone. In a private conversation that was never officially recorded, she told him something that made him lean back in absolute shock. "I made a mistake," she said, her professional facade cracking slightly. "I became obsessed with taking you down, with building this perfect case. But over these months I've received information about your father, about crimes he committed long before you were involved, about violence he perpetrated that went beyond business, personal violence against innocent people. Violence I initially attributed to you." "Are you telling me this?" Min-ho asked cautiously. "Because I'm a prosecutor and my job is to pursue justice, not vengeance. I pursued you out of vendetta when I should have pursued the actual architects of the crimes." She paused. "I'm filing a motion to have your conviction reviewed. The evidence I relied on to secure your guilty verdict is now questionable. I believe you deserve a new trial." The new trial was granted. And when evidence was re-examined, when witnesses who had been pressured by Min-ho's father to testify against him were re-interviewed, when the full scope of Kang De-young's decades-long criminal enterprise was exposed, everything changed. Min-ho was exonerated. His convictions were overturned. He walked out of prison after 6 months, a free man, to find Maya and Dahlia waiting for him outside the courthouse. He held his daughter for the first time in half a year and she cried, not from recognition but from the intensity of his grip. He held her like he was afraid she'd disappear. "I got you back," he whispered into her hair. "I got you back." Coming home to the penthouse felt like stepping into a dream. Nothing had changed externally but everything felt different. Min-ho was different. Prison had stripped away some of the hardness, left him raw and real in a way he'd never been. He threw himself into domestic life with the intensity he'd once reserved for empire building. He took over Dahlia's nighttime routine, the 3 a.m. feedings, the diaper changes. He sat with Maya while she recovered from the stress of his incarceration, holding her when she cried, telling her that they'd survived this and they could survive anything. "Want another baby?" he said one night, completely out of nowhere. Maya looked at him, stunned. "What?" "I want another child, a son maybe. Someone to grow up knowing his father from the beginning, not through prison glass." He was already hardening again as he made the decision, or perhaps softening. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. I want to be the father I never had. I want to build a family with you that's rooted in love, not crime. That sounds perfect, she said, and she meant it. By the time Dahlia was 1 year old, Maya was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was different. There was no danger lurking, no threats hanging over them, no secrets festering between them. There was just the ordinary beauty of preparing for a second child, of Min-ho laying his hand on her growing belly and talking to his unborn son, of them rebuilding their life on honest ground. Kang Deong received a 25-year sentence. It was a blow to the family, and it should have been catastrophic for Min-ho's rehabilitation. But instead, it had the opposite effect. Min-ho used his father's downfall as a demonstration of his own separation from that life. He invested in legitimate businesses, a hotel chain, a restaurant group, real estate development. The blood-soaked money was washed and transformed into something almost clean. Prosecutor Yeon-hee and Min-ho developed an unlikely friendship. She appreciated his cooperation in building cases against other syndicate members, his willingness to testify against former associates. He appreciated her integrity, her willingness to admit her mistakes. They would occasionally have coffee, discuss the legal system, the nature of justice and redemption. Do you ever regret it? Yeon-hee asked him once. Giving up the power of the empire, every day for the first month, Min-ho admitted. Now, not for a second. Power without someone to love is just loneliness with better furniture. Their son was born when Dahlia was 15 months old. They named him Min-jun after his father, and he arrived with all the drama of a man prepared for battle. He weighed 9 pounds, came 3 weeks early, and had his father's exact face, the same sharp features, the same intensity in his eyes even as a newborn. Watching Min-ho hold his son was like watching a man hold his entire future. He was careful, reverent, and there were tears streaming down his face. He's perfect, he whispered. Our family is perfect, my. Exhausted and overwhelmed with love, simply nodded and watched her husband become whole. The years passed with a kind of peaceful intensity that Maya had never imagined possible. The penthouse became a home filled with noise and chaos and joy. Dahlia grew into a determined, brilliant child who had inherited her father's protectiveness and her mother's emotional intelligence. Min-jun grew into a charming troublemaker, funny and quick, with his father's dangerous smirk and his mother's capacity for tenderness. Min-ho evolved from crime boss to legitimate businessman, though the reputation never fully faded. He would always be Kang Min-ho, the man who had ruled an empire before choosing love instead. But to his children he was simply Dad, the man who made pancakes on Saturday mornings, who attended school plays, who could be found in the study late at night handling business calls, always making sure his voice was warm when he talked to his family. And he never, ever looked at another woman the way he looked at Maya. By the time Dahlia was 5 and Min-jun was nearly 4, they'd moved out of the penthouse into a sprawling house in the prestigious Gangnam district. It had gardens and space, room for the children to run, a study for Min-ho's business, and most importantly, it was built on soil that wasn't stained with blood. It was a fresh start, a new empire built on love and legitimate success. Maya had returned to her architectural career, designing buildings that would last decades, that would serve communities, that represented something other than wealth and power. She was pregnant with their third child, a daughter, the ultrasound confirmed, and Min-ho was already planning the nursery with the intensity he brought to everything. One evening, after the children were asleep, they found themselves on the terrace overlooking the city. Min-ho held Maya from behind, his hand resting on her swollen belly, and said something he said often but never with less weight. I would burn down the world for you. I know, she said, leaning back against his chest, but I'd rather you build it instead. He laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in his chest, and pressed his lips to her hair. That's exactly what I'm doing. Every legitimate business, every honest deal, every day I don't resort to violence. That's me building the world you deserve. We're actually happy, she said, wonder in her voice. After everything, we're actually happy. He confirmed. And we're going to stay that way. I'm going to make sure of it. The third daughter was born on a spring morning, and they named her Yeon, meaning spring in Korean, a name that represented new beginnings and the season of growth. Like her siblings, she was absolutely perfect, and like her siblings, she had no idea that her father had once been a man capable of terrible violence. To Dahlia, Min-jun, and Yeon, their father was simply the man who loved their mother so deeply that it was almost visible, a force in the room when they were together. They watched him hold their mother's hand in public, saw him kiss her before leaving for work, noticed how his eyes always found her in a room full of people. Why are Mom and Dad always looking at each other like that? Dahlia asked her mother one day, genuinely confused. Because we love each other very much, Maya said simply. But like more than they love us? Min-jun asked, horrified at the concept. Different, Maya explained. Your father and I loved each other first, and that love is what made you and your siblings possible. It's the foundation that everything else is built on. Min-ho, listening from the study door, felt that love crystallized into something tangible and real. By the time Dahlia was 10 years old, Min-ho had been fully retired from any criminal enterprise for nearly a decade. The Kang family business was now run legitimately by his cousin Seok-jun, who had actually proven quite adept at transforming black money into white-collar operations. Kang Deong was in prison, his influence reduced to what could be smuggled through visitors, which wasn't much. Min-ho's brother Yi-sung ran the hotel empire and had become something of a legitimate businessman in his own right. Min-ho was 42 years old, successful, wealthy, and absolutely devoted to his family. He worked from a legitimate office in downtown Seoul, handled business development for their expanding corporate interests, and was known in legitimate circles as a shrewd businessman with an eye for emerging markets. But everyone still remembered what he'd been. Sometimes, when he walked into a restaurant, people would quiet slightly, their eyes tracking him. Occasionally, former associates would approach him, trying to recruit him for some darker enterprise, testing to see if the old Min-ho still existed beneath the expensive suits and wedding ring. He always declined with the same polite firmness. "I have a family now, that's the only business I'm interested in." On Dahlia's 10th birthday, Min-ho threw a party in the garden of their house. 50 children and their parents, tables laden with food, a stage set up for entertainment, fairy lights strung through the trees like captured stars. Dahlia was laughing, her face flushed with joy, absolutely certain that she was the most celebrated child in Seoul. Maya, 7 months pregnant with their 4th child, sat under a parasol watching the scene unfold. Min-ho moved through the party like a man still capable of orchestrating chaos. But this chaos was joyful, arranging games, ensuring every child was fed, catching Yeon before she wandered off toward the garden pond, breaking up a minor disagreement between Min-jun and another boy with diplomatic skill. He returned to Maya's side during a quieter moment, bringing her a cold drink and carefully kneeling in front of her to place his hand on her belly. "He's active today," she said, referring to the baby moving inside her. "Of course he is," Min-ho said with complete certainty. "He's a Kang, we're always active." She laughed and ran her fingers through his hair. "You're ridiculous." "I'm happy," he corrected. "There's a difference." And it was true. She could see it in every line of his face. The man who had once been defined by violence and fear had been replaced by someone defined by love and purpose. The predator had become the protector of innocent things. The criminal had become the creator. "I was thinking," he said, "that when this baby is born we should take a family trip somewhere peaceful, maybe Jeju Island. The kids would love it and you deserve a vacation." "What about your business?" "My business will manage for a week," he said dismissively. "My family is the priority, that's the only business that matters." She kissed him right there in the garden in front of half of Seoul's elite society and thought about how far they'd come. From an arranged marriage where he'd ignored her at a family dinner to this. A man who had burned his entire empire to the ground in order to protect her, who had chosen love over power, who was building something real and lasting and good. The 4th child was born in early fall and it was another daughter. They named her Si-hyun, meaning clear and kind, which is exactly what she was from the moment she entered the world. Min-ho cried more when Si-hyun was born than he had for all the previous children, overwhelmed by the repetition of the miracle, by the fact that he and Maya kept creating beauty together. 4 children, he said to his wife, holding their newborn, looking at their reality with profound gratitude. "A family, a life that's actually good. What about the empire?" Maya asked, teasing him gently. "Don't you miss the power?" He looked at his daughter, then at his wife, and then out the window of the hospital room at the Seoul skyline stretching endlessly beneath them. "No," he said with absolute certainty. "I have everything I ever actually wanted and it was waiting right in front of me the whole time. I was just too angry to see it." Min-ho was 45 years old when he made the decision to step even further back from business. Seok-jun was ready to fully take over operations. His younger brother Yi-sung was capable of handling the hotel chain. Legitimate business investments could run themselves with good management. And so Min-ho did something radical. He became primarily present. He picked the children up from school. He attended every parent-teacher conference. He coached Min-jun's soccer team. He helped Dahlia with her violin lessons. He changed diapers and packed lunches and read bedtime stories and did all the small, ordinary, extraordinary things that he'd missed during his years as an empire builder. And he and Maya rediscovered each other in the spaces between the chaos of raising 4 children. They had date nights again, rare. Precious moments where they were just 2 people who had loved each other through violence and poverty and everything in between. They would sit in restaurants and sometimes just look at each other, remembering that first kiss on the balcony of a gala, that desperate moment when she'd thrown herself in front of danger for him, all the tiny moments that had built into a life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once during one of these nights. "Marrying me?" "Choosing this life? Never," he said without hesitation. "You saved me, Maya, not with a bullet but with presence, with love, with the absolute refusal to let me destroy myself." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We saved each other," he agreed. "We did." When Min-ho was 48, his father was released from prison. At 72 years old, Kang Deong was broken by incarceration in a way he'd never been broken by violence. He came to stay with Min-ho's family not as a patriarch returned to power, but as an aging man trying to repair the damage he'd caused. Watching his father interact with his grandchildren was strange for Min-ho. He saw the tenderness there, the regret, the desire to give them something he'd never given his own children. And he saw clearly, for the first time, how the cycle had nearly perpetuated, how he had been well on his way to becoming his father, cold and distant and devoted to an empire at the expense of his family. "I'm sorry," his father said one evening when they were alone in Min-ho's study, "for raising you to believe that power was everything, For showing you a path built on violence and assuming you'd have no choice but to follow it. I did follow it, Min-ho said, not to blame him but to acknowledge the truth. I made those choices, I'm responsible for what I did, his father agreed. But if I had shown you a different way, perhaps you might have chosen differently from the beginning. Perhaps, Min-ho said, but I think I needed to learn the hard way. I needed to understand what power actually costs before I could value what matters. His father nodded, and there was peace in that nod. The peace of one generation acknowledging that they'd broken a cycle, that the cruelty would not continue. By the time Dahlia was in secondary school, she had begun to understand what her father had been. Her friends would look at him with awe mixed with fear. Teachers treated him with careful respect. She would hear whispered conversations about the man he used to be, the legend of Kang Min-ho, the crime boss who fell in love and chose differently. She confronted him about it one afternoon, found him in his study working, and asked directly, "Did you kill people?" Min-ho set down his pen, removed his glasses, and looked at his daughter with the seriousness she deserved. "Yes," he said simply. "I did things that I'm not proud of. I hurt people, I destroyed lives, I made choices that caused suffering." She asked, "Because I was angry and I was afraid and I didn't know any other way to protect myself." He paused. "Then I met your mother and she showed me that there were other ways. That strength didn't have to come from violence. That power could mean something different." "You regret it?" Dahlia asked. "Every day," he said, "but I can't change the past. All I can do is be better going forward and make sure that you and your siblings never feel like violence is an acceptable solution to your problems." Dahlia nodded, slowly processing. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you met Mom. I'm glad you changed." "So am I," Min-ho said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The day Min-ho took Dahlia to her father's grave was another kind of reckoning. Not his father's grave. Kang Deong was still alive, living with them, aging into something like genuine remorse. This was the grave of Choi Min-suk, the rival boss Min-ho had nearly killed the night before Dahlia was born. Choi Min-suk had died in prison, which is where Min-ho had arranged for him to be sent instead of dead. It was one of his last acts as a crime boss, choosing justice instead of murder. Dahlia didn't know that as she stood with her father at the grave, looking at the stone with the name of a stranger on it. "Why did we come here?" she asked. "Because I want you to understand something," Min-ho said quietly. "I nearly killed this man. I wanted to badly, and it wasn't until your mother showed me another way that I realized there were consequences to violence that I hadn't considered." "What do you mean?" Dahlia asked. "I mean that if I had killed him, his family would have had a reason to kill me. It would have started a cycle that probably would have resulted in me dead, your mother alone, and you unborn. Instead, I chose mercy. And look at us now." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's what I want you to remember, that in moments when you're angry or scared, when you feel like violence is the only option, remember that there's always another way. Always." Dahlia looked at her father, this man she'd grown up thinking was an ordinary businessman, and realized that he wasn't ordinary at all. He was extraordinary. He was a man who had lived in darkness and chosen the light. He was a man who had been a monster and become a father. Min-ho was 52 when he and Maya renewed their vows. It wasn't for any particular occasion. Their 20-year wedding anniversary had passed a few years earlier, but simply because they wanted to. They wanted to stand in front of their children and their loved ones and publicly recommit to the choice they'd made every single day for the past 2 decades. The ceremony was small, held in a chapel in Seoul, nothing like the grand affair of their first wedding. This one was intimate, real, filled with genuine love rather than obligation. Their children stood as witnesses. Min-ho's mother wept. Even prosecutor Yeon-hee, who had become a genuine friend over the years, was in attendance. "Take you again," Min-ho said, sliding a new ring onto Maya's finger, this one simpler than the first, less about cost and more about meaning. "As my wife, my partner, my conscience, I take you as the woman who saved me when I was drowning in darkness. I take you because I love you and because every day with you is a gift I don't deserve but will spend my life earning. I take you again," Maya said, her voice thick with tears, "as my husband, my protector, my reason for believing in love. I take you as the man you've become and in honor of the man you were. I take you because you chose me over and over again, even when choosing yourself would have been easier." When they kissed, Dahlia rolled her eyes at the PDA, but Min-jun and Yeon-yun looked delighted, and little Si-hyun clapped her hands happily, not fully understanding but understanding that something good was happening. The final piece of their redemption came when Min-ho founded a non-profit organization dedicated to helping people exit gang life. He didn't announce it publicly. He simply did the work quietly, using his extensive knowledge of how organized crime operated to help others escape it. He hired counselors, provided legal support, created job training programs. It was his way of paying penance, not to the criminal justice system which had already punished him, but to the universe, to himself, to all the people whose lives his previous choices had damaged. "Why do you do this?" Seok-jun asked him once, visiting the nonprofit's main office. "Because I can," Min-ho said simply. "Because I have the resources and the knowledge, and because it honors the choice I made to become someone different." By the time Min-ho was 55 years old, his organization had helped over 300 people exit organized crime. He was known in legitimate circles as a philanthropist, a successful businessman, a man who'd made remarkable contributions to Korean society. His criminal past was still whispered about, it would always be whispered about, but it had been recontextualized as something he'd survived, not something he was. Maya sat on the terrace of their Gangnam house one warm evening in spring, watching Min-ho play with their youngest, Seo-yeon, now 9 years old. Dahlia was away at university studying architecture like her mother. Min-jun was at soccer practice. Yeon-yeon was inside doing homework. It was one of the quiet moments that had become Min-ho's preference, small, intimate, real. She was 55 years old, still beautiful in the way of women who lived fully, who'd loved completely, who'd survived everything and chosen to keep loving anyway. She was holding a positive pregnancy test, which she'd taken just because something had felt different lately, and she was trying to decide how to tell her husband that they were about to become parents again. He looked up and saw her watching him, saw the test in her hand, and his entire face transformed. He asked, coming over to her. Leaving Seo-yeon happily drawing on the terrace tiles. "If you want to," she said. "I know we said 5 was the magic number," but he kissed her before she could finish, a kiss full of joy and wonder and the kind of love that had only deepened over the years. When he pulled back, he was grinning like the young man she'd married a lifetime ago, before she knew who he really was, before she'd seen his darkness and chosen to stay anyway. "Six, beautiful creation," he said, placing his hand on her still flat belly. "Welcome, little one. Welcome to a family built on second chances and true love." Sixth child was born on a winter morning in the same hospital where Dahlia had arrived, with Min-ho in the delivery room just as he'd been every single time. This time it was another son. They named him Taejun, meaning great and talented, because by this point they'd run out of poetic spring-related names and moved on to aspirational descriptors. Watching Min-ho hold his sixth child, at 56 years old, a man who still had the capacity to be transformed by fatherhood, was like watching someone complete a circle. The predator had become the protector. The empire builder had become a father. The man who'd once been consumed by darkness had become someone whose entire world revolved around creating light. "Never thought I'd have this," he said to Maya as she rested after the birth, exhausted but happy. "When I was young, I assumed the only life available to me was my father's life. I assumed I'd be defined by violence and power and fear. I never imagined that I could just be happy, that I could just be a good father and a good husband, and that would be enough." "Is enough," Maya said, reaching out to touch his face. "It's more than enough, it's everything. Because of you," he said. "None of this happens without you. You saved me, Maya. You saw something in me worth saving and you refused to let me become my father." "You saved yourself," she corrected. "I just loved you while you did it." He kissed her gently, reverently, and the moment held all the weight of their history, the dangerous beginning, the cold distance, the jealousy, the passion, the sacrifice, the redemption, the ordinary miracle of building a life together. In the years that followed, Min-ho watched his children grow into remarkable people. Dahlia became an architect, designing buildings that were both beautiful and sustainable. Min-jun became a lawyer, and not coincidentally, he specialized in cases involving organized crime prosecution and victim advocacy. Yeon-yeon became a teacher, helping children develop emotional intelligence and compassion. Seo-yeon became a doctor, carrying on the healing tradition that Min-ho had once tried to embody in his mother. And little Taejun was still just a kid, but already showing signs of his parents' intelligence and his father's protective instincts. None of them went into organized crime. None of them became consumed by the darkness that had nearly destroyed their father. Instead, they became people who contributed positively to society, who used the resources their father had provided to help others, who understood that true power came from creation, not destruction. On Dahlia's graduation from university, Min-ho stood in the audience and wept as he watched his daughter walk across the stage. She was 24 years old, accomplished and brilliant, and she was his legacy, not the legacy of blood and violence, but the legacy of love that had transformed one man completely and fundamentally. When she came off stage, she found him waiting, and he embraced her with the kind of fullness that only comes from knowing how close he'd come to never having any of this. "I'm so proud of you," he said. "Your mother and I are so proud of who you've become." "I learned from the best," she replied, and he understood that she meant not just the obvious, her mother's creativity, her father's strength, but also something deeper. She meant that she'd learned from watching two people love each other through darkness and emerge into light. At 58 years old, Min-ho began to slow down. He stepped fully away from his nonprofit's day-to-day operations, though he remained involved in major decisions. He delegated most of his business responsibilities to trusted lieutenants. What he didn't delegate was his role as a father and husband. He and Maya would wake early, walk in their garden, drink coffee in the morning light. They would hold hands in public without self-consciousness. They would sit in parks and watch people, and sometimes he'd identify someone in the danger of their situation, someone young and angry, clearly in some kind of criminal organization, and he'd watch them with the intensity of someone who'd been there, who understood the seductive pull of that life. Once, he approached a young man who reminded him of himself, gave him his card, told him that there were other options. The young man called 6 months later to say thank you. He'd gotten out, he'd gotten clean, he was starting a job in Min-ho's nonprofit. That conversation became one of Min-ho's most treasured memories. "A saint," Maya teased him one evening. "The opposite of a saint," he replied. "I'm a man who did terrible things and is spending the rest of his life trying to balance the scales." "Well, you're doing a good job," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "I'm proud of you." It was such a simple statement, but it meant everything. Her pride, her love, her continued choice to stand beside him, that was what had made him into the man he'd become. They were celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary when Maya became ill. It wasn't dramatic, just a persistent cough, some fatigue. They went to the doctor expecting nothing serious. They left with a diagnosis that shattered their world: advanced lung cancer, likely inoperable. Min-ho sat in that doctor's office and felt something inside him break in a way that made his years of violence seem like a light scratching. This was real pain. This was the kind of devastation that he couldn't protect his family from, couldn't fight his way out of, couldn't solve with money or power or devotion. They told the children. They prepared for treatment. They clung to each other with a kind of desperation that hadn't touched them since those early days when they were discovering their love. "I don't want to die," Maya said to him one night in their bed in the darkness. "I want to see our children's grandchildren. I want to grow old with you." "You will," he said, holding her, not believing it but needing to say it. "You're strong, Maya. You threw yourself in front of a bullet. You can survive this." But as the months passed, as chemotherapy and radiation took their toll, as Maya weakened despite their desperate hope, Min-ho understood that some battles couldn't be won. Some enemies couldn't be fought. Love wasn't enough when the body decided to betray you. She died on an autumn morning with all 6 of their children gathered around her and Min-ho holding her hand, telling her that he loved her, thanking her for saving him, apologizing for every moment he'd been cold or distant or cruel. "Be sorry," she whispered, barely audible. "You became a good man. You became the man I loved. That was my greatest achievement." Her last words were, "Take care of them. Be the father I always knew you could be." And then she was gone. The grief that followed was something Min-ho had never experienced. He'd known pain, the pain of loss, of regret, of knowing he'd hurt people. But this was different. This was existential. This was the kind of devastation that made him understand why he'd turned to violence in his younger years, why anger had seemed like a reasonable response to unbearable hurt, but he didn't turn back. Instead, he threw himself into his children, into the nonprofit, into honoring the woman who'd loved him completely by becoming worthy of that love every single day for the rest of his life. At the memorial service, thousands of people came. People he didn't know, people Maya had touched through her architectural work, her kindness, her simple presence. Colleagues, friends, former rivals, people from every walk of life, all there to say goodbye to a woman who had been extraordinary not through power, but through love. Dahlia gave the eulogy, speaking about her mother's strength, her capacity for forgiveness, her absolute belief that people could change. When she spoke about how her mother had thrown herself in front of a bullet to save their father, there was an audible gasp from the audience. Most people hadn't known the full story. "My mother believed in love," Dahlia said, tears streaming down her face. "She believed that it was possible for even the most hardened person to change, to grow, to become better, and she was right. She saved our father's life not just when she took that bullet, but every day after. When she chose to stand beside him despite knowing who he'd been. And in doing that, she changed our entire family's legacy." Min-ho, sitting in the front row, couldn't stop weeping. In the years after Maya's death, Min-ho became a different kind of man. His grief tempered him, made him kinder, more patient, more understanding of human suffering. He would visit the graves of people he'd hurt or killed during his criminal years and leave flowers, a penance that no one asked for but that he felt obligated to perform. He increased his nonprofit's budget, hired more staff, expanded into new cities. He wanted to help 1,000 people escape the life he'd lived, 100,000 if possible. He wanted to create the kind of net that might have caught him before he fell so deep into darkness. His children watched their father grieve with a maturity they'd learned from watching their parents love each other. They didn't try to make him get over it, didn't suggest he find another woman. They simply supported his grief, understanding that he wasn't meant to move on, he was meant to carry Maya with him for the rest of his life. At 65 years old, Min-ho became a grandfather. Dahlia gave birth to a daughter, and watching Min-ho hold his first grandchild was like watching him rediscover wonder. He held the tiny girl and said, "Welcome to a family built by love. Welcome to the legacy of your grandmother who loved so fiercely that she changed the world." He told his grandchild about her grandmother, stories about Maya's courage, her intelligence, her capacity to see the good in people. He made sure that the future generations would know not just that their ancestor had been brave, but that she'd been real, complex, beautiful, flawed, and utterly extraordinary. Min-ho was 72 years old when he retired completely from all business, legitimate or otherwise. He had enough wealth to last several lifetimes, enough resources to ensure his children and grandchildren were secure. What he did with his remaining years was a kind of pilgrimage. He traveled to the places he'd operated as a crime boss, the neighborhoods where his violence had left marks. He funded community centers and schools. He supported youth programs and athletic teams. He worked quietly without fanfare or publicity to repair the damage he'd done, and every evening, no matter where he was, he would find time to sit with a photo of Maya and remember. He would remember the first moment he'd seen her, the weight of her when she'd thrown herself in front of danger, the joy in her face when she held their children, the strength it took for her to love him completely despite knowing his history. He would tell anyone who asked, and many people did because his story had become legendary, that love wasn't weakness. It was the strongest force on earth. It was more powerful than violence, more enduring than hate, more transformative than any weapon or empire or amount of money. It was what had saved him, what had redeemed him, what had made him into something more than the sum of his crimes. Min-ho died peacefully in his sleep at 83 years old, exactly 10 years after Maya's death. His last words, spoken to his eldest daughter as he felt the end approaching, were, "Tell your mother I'm coming home." Funeral was massive. Thousands of people came to pay respects. Crime bosses and prosecutors, business leaders and reformed criminals, activists and teachers and people from every walk of life, all there to say goodbye to a man who had been transformed by love. Dahlia gave the final eulogy, speaking about her father's journey from criminal to redeemed man, from isolated king to devoted father, from predator to protector. "My father used to tell us that my mother was the love of his life," Dahlia said, looking out at the crowd. "But what we all learned was that she wasn't just the love of his life, she was the life of his love. She was the reason he changed. She was the reason we exist as a family built on hope rather than fear. And in choosing her, in loving her completely, my father showed all of us that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be." As they scattered his ashes, half into the wind in Seoul, half into the ocean where Maya's ashes had been scattered, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered together, united not by blood and trauma, but by love and the knowledge that they'd been born from the greatest love story ever told. 50 years later, Dahlia sat with her own grandchildren and told them the story one more time. The story of how her parents had met, how they'd been strangers brought together by business, how her father had nearly destroyed himself until love had intervened, how her mother had sacrificed herself, how her father had redeemed himself, how they'd built a family that rippled out into generations of goodness. "Were they real people?" the youngest grandchild asked. "Real," Dahlia said, smiling through tears. "And their love was the most real thing that ever existed." She showed them pictures, her father in his youth dangerous and hardened, her mother beautiful and brave. The moment they finally looked at each other with recognition and want. Their wedding photos, images of their children being born, pictures of them old, still holding hands, still looking at each other like they were the only people in the world. "What's the most important lesson they taught you?" the oldest grandchild asked. Dahlia thought about her parents, about their journey from enemies to soulmates, from strangers to the most devoted partners she'd ever witnessed. "That love isn't about being perfect," she said finally. "It's about choosing each other over and over again, even when it's hard. It's about seeing someone completely, all their darkness, all their capacity for destruction, and choosing to love them anyway. And when you do that, when you love someone that completely, you have the power to transform not just them but the entire world." Children listened, enraptured, understanding that they were heirs to the greatest love story ever told, not because it was perfect but because it was real, was hard-won, was built on sacrifice and redemption and the absolute conviction that love could change anything. And somewhere in the spring breeze that rustled through the trees, in the warmth of the sun on their faces, in the genetic legacy of a love so powerful it rewrote destiny, Min-ho and Maya existed still, eternal, immortal proof that even the darkest souls could be saved by love.